In this episode, Julia Kim, a co-author to Limits and Beyond, shares the lessons from Bhutan's national-level experiment of gross national happiness and explores the applications of well-being economics across the globe. The talk is moderated by Roberto Pasqualino from the University of Cambridge.
Thank you very much for coming. Today is the third seminar of this seminar series. We had Jorgen Randers and Gaia Harrington in the past 2 Mondays. Today we have Julia Kim that is calling from 8 in the morning in Vancouver. So Julia, if you want to unmute and say hi to this audience here.
Good morning, or I guess it's good afternoon for everyone in the UK. I'm happy to be here. I'm really delighted to be a part of this conversation, Roberta. And I was happy to be part of Jorgen's presentation as well, and I joined for Gaia's. So as I said earlier, it feels a little bit like the Olympics when someone is passing the baton over to you. I want to be able to pick up that baton and carry the story forward a little bit. So happy to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We'll get back to Julia in 5 minutes. First, I want to say next week we have Ugo Bardi. He is also very famous in the context of Limits to Growth. Then we have Manfreda Raffaele, co-president of the Club of Rome, very influential person, founder of the Nelson Mandela Foundation in South Africa. And she will speak more about the human aspect. Then it will be me about my model in finance, energy, and it's a bit more complicated. Then Jayati Ghosh, who is going to basically cover the entire background of the Earth for All book. The background Limits to Growth. So that's the big thing. They were famous. This is the team in 50 years ago. They were famous because they said basically that the world might collapse at some point because growth will go exponentially and will overshoot the barriers of the planet and collapse. Things to say are the following. So just opening some criticisms as well about Limits to Growth. Who were here at the time in 1973? William Nordhaus. So one criticism he placed to Limits to Growth was you're building a model without proper data, and we don't agree with that. So it's not going to be in line with everything we try to say in our scientific domain. So we disagree with that. However, the reality is this. So biodiversity collapsing, we pass all the threshold, we are really destroying the planet. Really, maybe somebody else was right at the time rather than the Nobel Prizes. And the point is this: if you can measure it, we cannot manage it. So that was answering the criticism of Limits to Growth, which was not being able to really demonstrate with practice what was happening. He kind of did, and that became extremely influential to us. So now another things to say, because today we're going to talk about indicators and measurement of progress. The concepts like these have been around for such a long time. So you have steady state of economics, for example, Herman Daly, who also passed away like last month. So it was the father of ecological economics. And then this other report of Donella Meadows, another one of the leader of the Limits to Growth, was indicator for an information system for sustainable development that I suggest people, if are interested, to have a look, because it's also available online. So one thing to say about indicators is the following. So what they said, that was the Herman Daly pyramid in the 1973 paper. It was like, GDP is an indicator, like many others, but it's not indicating everything. We cannot use that for measuring something it's not. So he basically tried to split things up in different things. So at the bottom, put the ultimate ends, which are basically the natural source, the climate, all the biodiversity things, so everything which is practical. And then it was like, let's try to connect to the intermediate means. That's where you put GDP and things like that. So labor, productivity, all these economic variables, right? That are basically useful for managing things, let's say. But from there, you can go to the intermediate ends, which basically is about human capital, social capital, health, wealth, which are, again, a bit more difficult to measure sometimes. It's difficult to measure things like health, the impact of knowledge, things like that. That's, if you think about that, the Sustainable Development Goals try to go in that direction as well. So go beyond GDP, all these kind of things. And then at the end, even beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, you get well-being, you get the ultimate ends, you get this opportunity basically to try to measure things which are very hard to measure. Are you happy? How can you say? Are you sad? How much is it? So it's very hard to say. But the important thing of the indicators from this slide is the following: that's different people don't understand all of the indicators. They understand some of them, and the indicators somehow help people to connect among each other. So if you go to speak to the government, so that's the parliament, they might understand the labor and taxes and GDP and things like that, but they find very hard to understand things like climate change. So the result is that all the scientific community end up with 1.5 degrees target, 2 degrees target. That's become the target for them. So the indicator becomes important to explain to somebody else what you're doing. So that's pretty much the concept. And that's actually the big change, the big challenge, to explain again to those who take decision what we're doing with the indicators of well-being, that I think Kim will say a lot about. Kim, she did a lot of work on well-being, many years. She's one of the authors of these two books. For Earth for All, she's been more like viewer. And for Limits and Beyond, she wrote an entire chapter called Bhutan and Beyond, the Emergence of Wellbeing Economies. She's program director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan, co-author with these books. She spent a lot of work in the United Nations, in Africa, developing countries, from the medical frontier. I don't know if that's enough to represent you, Julia. Probably not, but I think at this point I spoke probably already too much, so I give you the time to give your talk.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And thanks for framing it within that arc. I think there's a lot of really good information synthesis there. And as I was listening to you speaking, you really have the sense that we're coming into a conversation that's been developing over a long period of time and with some very great minds and hearts behind it. I wanted to start by saying one of the things I want to touch on today is different ways of knowing. And we've used terms to think about this kind of work: quantitative, qualitative, analytic. For myself, I think of myself as somebody who has been exploring this question of well-being and health and sustainable development from the point of view of a simple human being. And I myself, I would say I'm as much an artist as I am a scientist. So through my presentation, I will try to share some of my perspectives that I've experienced as I've gone through this exploration of what does it mean to live on a finite planet with well-being and equity, but also drawing on my personal experiences as well as the data, as well as the science. So maybe a little bit by way of telling my own story. I started out as a young medical doctor training in Canada, and very idealistic and very confident about my skills as a technical physician in trying to reduce some of the suffering in the world. Kind of a viewpoint that maybe many of us start out with as we embarked on our careers. I had the interesting and really fortunate opportunity to spend some time in South Africa early on in my training. And I was kind of catapulted from kind of developed country comfort into circumstances that were very hard for me to adjust to and to take in, a kind of level of poverty in rural South Africa that I had not encountered in my own experience. And while it was challenging emotionally and also pushed me to really think about what were my skills going to deliver in a context where people didn't have enough to eat and where HIV/AIDS was really taking off in the country, it also opened my eyes to the possibility of different ways of living. I was training primary healthcare nurses in this rural area. And after our training, there would often be a celebration or a party, a braai, as we would call it in South Africa, where I would see such exuberance and celebration and gratitude for small things, even though I knew that we had been talking about some very difficult and serious issues around HIV. And that contrasted with when I would return to London, actually. This was the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I was doing my master's in public health. And I would come onto the tube and I'd be full of this bubbling energy of South Africa. And I'd try to start up a conversation or make eye contact with somebody on the tube. And I'd be kind of pinned down with this stony stare, as if to say, have you forgotten to take your psychotropic medications this morning? And it kind of raised in my mind this question of what is development? As we move towards more and more material security and comfort, is there something about our spontaneity and our connection with others that maybe is getting diluted in that process? Well, that question continued when I moved to UNDP because development is in the middle name there. And I was really trying to understand what is this development model that we are trying to import onto the so-called developing countries? Is it all really an advancement, or are there some serious questions that continued in my mind? At the same time, I was swept up by the busyness of New York City, and I realized that in order to keep my own well-being and kind of my own sense of being in connection with the world, I really needed to also take some time to cultivate the ability to be well. So I spent some time going back and forth to meditation retreats and really tried to strengthen it as a skill to be able to move in these very complex environments and still be grounded. It turns out that Manhattan was a bit of a culture shock to me. So many people would ask me when I went to Southern Africa, wasn't it a culture shock? Well, yes. But after 10 years in Southern Africa, coming back to North America was as much of a culture shock to me. And to see how much people were pressured in terms of time, people who were pulling in double incomes for a family, who were really living with a sense of insecurity, given the kinds of debt that they were taking on, the cost of educating kids, a sense of poverty in this incredibly wealthy country that I was again trying to reconcile with my experiences in the so-called developing world. And it was while I was at the UN that I had the chance to be part of the 2012 high-level meeting that was held at the UN under the leadership of the Royal Government of Bhutan. And it was there that I first heard about gross national happiness and had the chance to engage with some of the ministers and indeed the first Prime Minister around this idea of what would a new development or economic paradigm look like that put the happiness and well-being of all and not just GDP growth at the center of our development. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of how I came to be engaged in this world. As you know, this is part of a series on the publication and movement Earth for All that has been spearheaded by many of the organizations that Roberto mentioned. And it's really putting forward the idea that we have crossed many dangerous ecological tipping points, but raising the possibility that we have also reached a positive social tipping point. In other words, around the world, citizens feel ready for change, and that it might be really time to think about how do we upgrade our economic system beyond GDP. So going back to the measurement paradigm that Roberto was referencing. The report, if you have a chance to look at it, or if you had a chance to hear Jorgen Randers and Gaia Harrington previously, really calls for bold and innovative policymaking and frames it around 5 system-wide turnarounds that could really shift the dial for us. And it's really not about just tinkering around the edges of the current system and doing this in a way that is imbued with social justice. I'm sure many of you were a part of the previous talk, which I also listened to, which was excellent. Gaia Harrington speaking about her own research. And I'm quoting her here when she said, we still have time to turn around society, but only if instead of growth, we focus on meeting human needs within planetary boundaries. And she noted that, 3 out of 4 people in G20 countries are actually aware that the Earth is approaching tipping points. And they support the idea of deep systems change, prioritizing health, well-being on the planet. So in some ways, the message is dire, but it's also, I think, tinged with a sense of hope if we really look at the kinds of changes that we're talking about. So with that as kind of a backdrop, let me share what I hope we can cover during this time together. So I want to share some of the emerging lessons from Bhutan and gross national happiness based on the systems perspective that we've been talking about. And again, not to put it forward as kind of a Shangri-La or perfect example of moving towards a different economic paradigm, but rather about a country that is a living experiment that is actually deep in the challenge of moving beyond a GDP-based framework. And what are some of the lessons that we can learn from the small country in the Himalayas? I want to expand that to talk about well-being economies more generally. That may be a new term for some people here, and share some of the perspectives of Bhutan, which says that we need to look at both the inner transformation and systems change if we're going to move to a new paradigm towards a well-being economy. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the inner transformation aspect means. In that context, I want to share some of the new research and thinking around what's called awareness-based systems change. So really cultivating our capacity to deeply sense ourselves as part of the larger system and co-create an emerging future. So again, drawing on the question of how do we get there from our current situation. And I want to share some examples, some emerging seeds of innovation and application from different parts of the world. So for those who are new to system thinking, I really like this definition from Peter Senge at MIT. And he really talks about systems thinking as a discipline for seeing wholes. So it's really a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things, for seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots, and for seeing the root causes rather than the symptoms. And this is really important when we're talking about something as fundamental as the economic system, which for most of us just feels like the air we're breathing. We don't really think about what's underneath it. Gaia Harrington also referenced the iceberg, which I think is a brilliant way of thinking about systems. And as you know, only about 1/7 of an iceberg is visible above the water. You can think about that as the world that we see. And what doesn't show beneath the surface is what's underneath all the visible behaviors and the symptoms and the news headlines that we are bombarded with. That is the structures and the systems that are underlying our current crises. And more importantly than that, the paradigms of thought. What are the stories we tell ourselves? What are the mental models that we are unconsciously holding about how our society should be, how the economy should be? And what's even more rarely talked about are what are the sources of inspiration that in turn give rise to these paradigms of thought. And this is the work of Otto Scharmer at the Presencing Institute and MIT. And he often references the visions, the values, and the mindsets, which are often the deepest part of the iceberg and not very closely examined. And as we know, Donella Meadows has been quoted several times, really a brilliant mind and quite beautiful person who talked about mindsets and paradigms guiding behaviors. And because of that, they can have a profound impact if we can change them. In other words, people who manage to intervene at the level of paradigm hit a leverage point that can totally transform the system. So again, we're talking not about tinkering around the edges of a system, but really going deep and asking what are the sources of the current situation and the current crises that we see ourselves in. So building on Otto Scharmer's work, if you think about what's below the surface of the iceberg, he would argue that amidst all the interrelated crises that we're seeing, you could probably distill them into three key clusters, which he would think about as three divides. The disconnect between self and nature, an ecological disconnect you could think of. The disconnect between ourselves and others, or a social disconnect. And finally, one that we don't think about very often, which is a spiritual disconnect, which you could think of as a disconnect between ourself and our highest sense of ourself, our aspiration, our hopes, our sense of human potential. So just sharing some research on these three disconnects and the way that they're showing up. In terms of the spiritual disconnect, we know from research that our sense of meaning and purpose is actually vital for our sense of health and well-being and our human flourishing. We know that depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide and a major contributor to the overall global burden of disease. So not so much cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on, but depression and the crisis of mental health that we're seeing in many parts of the world. In terms of our social disconnect, we know that connection and community are vital for our sense of well-being. Yet many of us are increasingly living in situations with rising inequality, the resulting social tension and community breakdown. One of the ironies of our high-tech digital age is that we're more connected in many ways, and at the same time, more lonely than ever before. And the disconnect from nature is really evident. We're sitting in the David Attenborough building, and we know that we're in the middle of an ecological crisis, crossing multiple ecological tipping points. So to talk now about how G&H came to be, the gross national happiness vision actually started with a young king who in the 1970s was asked by a reporter, what is the gross national product of Bhutan? And instead of responding with a number, actually replied that in Bhutan, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. And that's how the term came to be known. Really, this young leader expressing his vision for Bhutan as being one in which the country would not try to grow by GDP as quickly as possible, but try to grow the well-being of the population in harmony with nature as it was advancing and globalizing. It's interesting that around the same time, Senator Robert Kennedy was on the campaign trail in the United States and made a brilliant speech, I think at the University of Kansas, where he said that gross national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. It's on YouTube. It's a brilliant video if people want to see the whole speech. So it's interesting to look back now and say, well, how did this all happen? How did GDP become the target and the obsession? Well, its origins in the 1940s, it made sense as it would be able to measure marketed economic activity and try to predict fluctuations in the economy, just coming out of the Depression and the World Wars. But it was never intended to be a measure of how well a country's doing, its status in the world, its success, or its well-being. And even its creator, Simon Kuznets, clearly stated that. There are several problems with using GDP in this way. One is, as I mentioned, it measures only marketed economic activity, and all this is counted as positive. It makes the number bigger, even if it involves cutting down the rainforests, for example, in Brazil, leading to more pollution, or if the COVID pandemic is leading to more hospitalizations and more illness. It fails to measure a lot of the activities that actually enhance well-being, but are out of the formal market. And this includes a lot of the care and the household work that primarily women do in our societies, our leisure time, and the kind of vibrancy of our communities. None of that shows up in the GDP number. And really problematically, what it hides is rising inequality and the environmental destruction that is happening as GDP grows. So as you look at it as a number, there's actually no guarantee of well-being. In fact, far from it. And these problems are now more and more widely recognized and acknowledged by economists, governments, and many global institutions. So as we know, GDP, a certain amount of economic growth is absolutely important. You need to meet basic needs. But what's interesting is that as you look at wealthy countries, as GDP per capita goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean that well-being will go up. And this is a graph from the United States looking at GDP per capita in red over the period of 1972 to 2006, and looking at subjective life satisfaction reported during the same time in red. And you can see that at a certain point of GDP growth, well-being and life satisfaction actually stays the same and even plateaus. It seems that what matters more than incremental increases in GDP in developed countries are things that most of us acknowledge and can probably identify with: a sense of community trust, a sense of trust in the government, meaningful and secure work, and work-life balance. So that was looking at one country, the United States. If we look at a range of developed countries, you can see that GDP growth, if it's associated with widening inequity, is actually associated with this composite of health and social problems, which is on the vertical axis. You can see there life expectancy, literacy levels, trust, rates of teen pregnancy, rates of homicide. And if you look at that index of social and health problems, as countries become more and more unequal, those problems get worse. And you can see on the upper right corner, the United States, and in the lower left corner, some of the more equitable countries, many of which are the Nordic countries in Europe. So again, more and more data challenging the supremacy of GDP. So let's turn a little bit now to Bhutan's experiment around gross national happiness and unpack this word happiness a little bit. It's not the kind of frivolous moments of feeling good that many of us might associate with it. It's hard to orient a country's development based on those kinds of feelings. But rather, it's, as the first Prime Minister of Bhutan put it, it's about relationships and about guiding where the country is going. And he defined happiness by saying that lasting or abiding happiness can't actually exist while others around you are suffering, and comes only from serving others, living in harmony with nature, and realizing our innate wisdom. So as you think about this definition, it's deeply relational, and it's actually bringing together those three disconnects that I mentioned earlier. Bhutan is unique in talking about development as being the balancing of material and spiritual development, transforming both the outer and the inner conditions for human flourishing. And this really counters this caricature out of economics of human beings as Homo economicus, instead putting forward a vision of humanity, which is about cultivating our highest human potential. This would be embedded in this idea of development. So how do we go about this? The outer transformation you could think about as how do we create the enabling environment for people to be happy or well? As a government, you can't force people to be happy, but you can take on the responsibility of trying to create the conditions. And in Bhutan, gross national happiness is measured in a survey that looks at these 9 domains that you see up there with 33 different indicators. You'll see that it's about meeting the basic needs of a population and balancing the material and more intangible factors for well-being. So some of the more standard areas that you see in many development surveys, living standards, health, education, environment are included in the survey. Also some of the more unusual but important areas, time use, community vitality, cultural diversity, psychological well-being. And many of us have known and experienced these dimensions actually to be really important during lockdown, during the COVID pandemic. So it's important to also say that the survey isn't about taking people who are at 90% up to 100%. It's really built on this idea of sufficiency. How much is enough to be well? So within each of the 9 domains, there's a statistically set sufficiency threshold where you would be considered to be happy or to be well in that domain if you hit that threshold. And then taken together around the 9 domains, there's a happiness threshold where you'd be considered sufficient if you met that threshold in 6 out of the 9 domains. So again, it leaves room for some variability and differences between individuals in the population. So we all know that a survey itself isn't enough. It's really about how do we use a survey to focus on measuring what matters and then somehow translate that into action at a country level. So it begins with the vision, as I mentioned earlier, asking really what is the purpose of the economy. Following that up with measures, the surveys conducted by the Center for Bhutan Studies and G&H Research, really looking at who is falling behind, enabling as many as possible to meet those sufficiency thresholds. It's about using a G&H screening tool to guide policy and planning. That's the G&H Commission, which applies those 9 domains to see whether they should be building a mine, how would it be doing, not just in job creation and environmental impacts, but on community, on health, on the other domains that I mentioned. And then finally, all this could be quite top-down and policy-heavy. And this is where the organization I'm working with, the G&H Center in Bhutan, a civil society or NGO organization, is trying to apply and adapt the G&H values and metrics in different contexts across different sectors and scales, working with business, education, communities, youth, and increasingly engaging not just in Bhutan, but internationally. So how would this look? How is this showing up in aligning policy and action in Bhutan? One of the things you might notice when you land there is the lack of billboard advertising, really allowing nature to speak for itself. In terms of prioritizing people, even though the country has by GDP modest budget, they are still managing to prioritize universal free basic health and education in the country, and really ensuring that healthcare workers and teachers are valued. Some of you may be aware that Bhutan is the first and only carbon negative country in the world and a biodiversity hotspot. They've actually committed to keep at least 60% of the country under forest cover for all time. It's not easy to get to Bhutan to travel as a tourist. That's because they have a high value, low impact tourism policy. So really restricting the number of tourists who come in, really in order to balance against the social and environmental impacts. And finally, the inner transformation aspect that I mentioned earlier, really trying to bring the GNH values and vision into the education system. Meditation is taught in schools, values around self-leadership, trying to at least begin to plant the seeds of a culture that is more embedded in compassion than competition, and to really look at encouraging things like volunteerism. For those who are interested, there were some articles that came out in the past couple of years around Bhutan's unique response to the COVID pandemic, really looking at how this culture of volunteering has supported the country, really created a foundation of resilience, even during the very difficult challenge of the COVID pandemic. So all of this while advancing key development indicators. So trying to meet the basic needs, reducing poverty and infant mortality rates, rising life expectancy and primary school enrollment in the country, and a significant increase in the Human Development Index, putting Bhutan into the middle human development category. So that isn't to say that everything is perfect in Bhutan. There are emerging challenges. Some of the findings, for example, from the latest GNH survey showed that farmers were less happy than other occupations. Interestingly, women were less happy than men as a whole. And for the first time in terms of age groups, the Bhutanese youth were less happy than other age groups. So as a policymaker, that should pique your curiosity and interest, and you should be asking what is going on, what are the changes that we're seeing, how should we be responding? And so there have been efforts to really strengthen rural infrastructure, provide more widespread electricity access, initiatives to improve women's empowerment and political participation, and tackling the growing youth unemployment and exposure to social media and globalization. So any of the leaders in Bhutan would speak about GNH really as a journey rather than a destination. They're quite humble about what Bhutan has accomplished and quite open about some of the challenges that are being faced in the country. So going beyond the Shangri-La myth, again, the Prime Minister of Bhutan at the UN said, Bhutan isn't a country that has attained GNH. Like most developing countries, we're struggling with the challenge of meeting our basic needs. But what we would say separates us from most others is that we've made happiness the most fundamental of human needs as a goal of societal change. So again, thinking about getting below that iceberg to what are the vision and values that are shaping the paradigm, then shaping the systems and structures of the economy. So I want to shift gears a little bit here and broaden the conversation beyond Bhutan to talk about what would this look like if we were to think about a well-being economy. And this is a definition from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. A well-being economy would serve people and planet rather than people and planet serving the economy. And as you can imagine, this will require getting below the surface. And it raises a question, why do we need a shift in consciousness? What are we up against? And how can we actually reclaim our attention? And this is where I want to touch on this notion of awareness-based systems change. So some of the challenges for building a well-being economy is this question of how much is enough. And I think in many wealthy countries, we can see that we're being actually programmed to overconsume. And a lot of the social science research is showing that many of us now actually shop for status and affirmation rather than need. So breaking these habits and addictions is difficult. The painful irony of all this is that the increased income and consumption that we enjoy has actually little to no benefit on our overall well-being. And in fact, when I came back to North America and was encountered FOMO, which I learned was fear of missing out, this kind of mindset of constantly comparing and not having enough and the feeling like you're missing something is contributing to the sense of lack of well-being, as well as at the same time devastating our planet. So it really raises the question, can we and how can we reclaim our attention and actually detox from the barrage of distraction and outright manipulation that is apparent through the advertising and social media to actually be masters rather than puppets of our technology? For those who saw the documentary Social Dilemma, a lot of really important insights there. So not to say that technology itself is always bad, but to what extent are we actually using it in ways that are positive and contributing to a thriving planet? And of course, none of this is happening in a vacuum. We are living in entrenched systems that have been actually supported by decades of neoliberal economic policy and vested interests. So these changes are not going to be come about easily. So it raises a question, what is this systems change? For example, the new measurements beyond GDP, the policy, the activism that is needed, and the shift in consciousness that are both required. And my chapter in the book that Roberto mentioned, in Limits and Beyond, goes a little bit deeper into these questions. So sharing some of the scientific research on well-being that I think sheds some light on this. This is a great article that was published in Science. The title is "A Distracted Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And it's a very elegant study done by Harvard researchers where they use smartphones to track volunteers. And you would get pinged at various random moments, and you would need to answer, how happy are you feeling at the moment? What are you currently doing? And were you actually thinking about what you're currently doing or about something else? In other words, were you distracted? Well, it turns out that on average, we spend almost half of our waking hours thinking about something other than what we're doing. And this mind wandering actually typically makes us feel unhappy. The researchers concluded that mind wandering is an excellent predictor of unhappiness. In fact, it's a better predictor than what we're actually engaged in at that time. So in other words, it's not so much whether you're doing the dishes or whether you're having a romantic candlelit dinner with somebody that you love. It's whether you're actually present with washing the dishes or present with that dinner partner that you're sitting across from that characterizes your sense of well-being at that moment. What is a bit worrisome about this research is the parallel research that is documenting how much time our young people are now spending on their screens and not connected to their bodies, not connected to what's going on around them. So the good news is, in terms of the shift in consciousness, is that we are actually living in really interesting times when we're seeing a convergence of ancient wisdom and modern science coming together, really to talk about how can we reclaim our attention. Some people speak about it as the attention economy, that there's a constant war from commerce, marketing, advertising, social media for our attention. So how do we counterbalance that? Again, knowing that we're not living in a vacuum. The science in this area speaks about the impact of practices like meditation in actually shaping the way our brain's connectivity and the way our neurons are actually firing based on the kinds of activities that we spend our time doing. It's been shown, for example, to improve our ability to cope with stress and to have greater resilience. And there's also been evidence to show that our ability to keep open-hearted, to have a sense of altruism, to be more willing to share and to volunteer, these skills can also be cultivated and trained. Richard Davidson, who's been leading a lot of the neuroscience research at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin, speaks about exercising our minds really being approached in the same way that we now think about exercising our bodies. We don't assume we will all have physical health if we just sit in our chairs and we don't actually train our bodies. Maybe it's time to begin thinking about what are we ingesting with our minds, and are there ways to develop our resilience and our attention in these modern times. The Healthy Minds program, which has been based on some of this neuroscience research, talks about 4 core pillars of well-being. One is awareness, that simple ability to be present that I mentioned earlier, not being drawn out constantly into distraction. The second is connection, our ability to appreciate what's going on, the kindness and compassion that we can bring into everyday life. Insight into how our minds work. For many of us, we have a constant half-conscious narrative or story that we're telling ourselves. So to bring more insight and awareness to that. And then a sense of purpose, which I mentioned earlier, which is vital to our sense of well-being, really reconnecting to our values and our motivation, even in challenging times. And as you can imagine, these skills are really important for those who are kind of working on the front lines of many of the global crises I mentioned earlier. So this kind of secular Healthy Minds program is being applied in education, healthcare, business, and climate and social justice activism in many different contexts. So if we were to look at this idea of awareness and bring it together with this notion of systems change. This is a really interesting paper that was contributed by Otto Scharmer to the Earth for All book. It's a separate deep dive paper by many of the authors. And he talks about how do we transform our economies from ego to eco. And as he points out, if we're looking at systems change, it's going to require more than data and facts. And this comes back to my earlier opening remarks that it's we all have to sharpen our analytical, quantitative, rational thinking skills, but that will not be enough. It requires a holding space and a view that actually enables multi-stakeholders to engage with these issues with a much deeper and nuanced sense of intelligence, so that we don't fragment into the kind of divisive argumentation and kind of taking apart of the problem without seeing the bigger picture. So when we are talking about building a well-being economy, what is our ability to engage it with an open mind, to suspend judgment? Are we able to see a problem through the eyes of others, to have more of an open heart? And importantly, when we think about shifting paradigms and the kind of fear that that often brings up, are we able to let go of the old so that something new can actually emerge, an open will? This approach to systems change and to prototyping the new has started to happen through various action learning labs. The GNH Center Bhutan has collaborated with Schumacher College in the UK over a number of years to look at the right livelihood and GNH program. In other words, how do you bring a concept like GNH into your personal work and life? The Global Wellbeing Lab, which is another action learning lab, here the GNH Center collaborated with the Presencing Institute and the Global Leadership Academy at GIZ in Germany, looking at how do we bring these principles to those working at policymaking and government, business, and also activists working in civil society. The Presencing Institute has collaborated with UNDP over a series of projects across 14 UN country teams in the UN SDG Leadership Lab, again, bringing this awareness-based systems change approach into the work. It's now expanding into what's called a youth school, a network of local to global platforms for really cultivating this, what you could think of as transformation literacy, and bringing a movement building aspect to that. So some more information on it there. Again, it's really saying that there is often a blind spot when we think about leadership. We're always looking for how can we change the outer system without asking what is the condition of our inner leadership as we do that change. And this quote from Otto Scharman and Katrin Koffer, the success of our actions as change makers doesn't depend so much on what we do or how we do it, but actually what is the inner place from which we're operating. So to turn our observation from outside to look at ourselves and to recognize that we can't transform the behavior of the system unless we transform the quality of attention that people apply to their actions within those systems, both individually and collectively. So again, this talks about cultivating our capacities to do this kind of work. 3 intelligences that I mentioned earlier, which are vital for the inner leadership to move towards a well-being economy, our ability to move from a judgmental kind of binary mindset to one of curiosity, openness, and engagement. The ability to really move from a feeling of cynicism, which I know often arises for us when we look about making deeper change, to have an open heart that is really interested in understanding what is it in someone else's shoes, how can we see from someone else's eyes, and to have some compassion in that engagement. And to move from the fear, as I mentioned earlier, to one of courage, to really be willing to step out into making wider change. And perhaps most importantly, letting go of what we are currently experiencing in a system that is starting to fall apart, and to allow something new to emerge, something that is not yet fully formed, rather than tinkering around the edges and trying to prop up the current system. So I'll close with some of the examples of how this is being showing up in different places. Some of my co-authors from the Right Livelihood and G&H program, we did some interviews with participants looking at what they experienced in their projects and their activities. They spoke about the inward shift, finding calm inside myself and the courage to step out into action, practicing boldness, realizing that to change is to become more of who we are, while at the same time trying to implement some of these small changes and shifts in their own communities and their own work. One woman in the UK started silent spaces in gardens where people would be able to basically turn off their phones, turn off their digital technology, and actually be with nature for a moment in these public gardens. Another participant was applying G&H to a horticultural apprenticeship program. An engineering professor in Thailand, rather than basing the curriculum on competition, really focusing on reflexive pedagogies and really focusing on how do we look at sustainable technologies. And a business leader in Hong Kong looking at an Asian venture philanthropy event focusing on sustainable finance. So again, the inner and the outer transformation going hand in hand. Many people often ask, what can I do as an individual? It seems huge. And I was inspired at a talk recently by Kate Rayworth when she mentioned this organization. I think they began in New Zealand. It's becoming a bit of a global movement. It's called Take the Jump, and really saying that the change starts at home and really looking at 6 lifestyle actions that both save money and reduce carbon emissions. So for example, really making a commitment to try and keep products that you buy for at least 7 years, not just to get the next newest iPhone because everybody else seems to be doing that. As much as possible to try to reduce or eliminate personal vehicles and use public transport. As much as possible, moving to a plant-based diet. I love this one, dress retro, which means really hanging on to the clothes that you love, not just buying new ones because the change of season is here, trying to limit to 3 new items per year. Really trying to have the local holidays rather than traveling abroad. For those of us who are on the international speaker circuit, really scrutinizing, do I really need to travel to that meeting in Europe? Or can I, for example, do it on Zoom as we're doing here today? And then also looking at an opportunity to engage in changing the system, whether it's looking at where your pension is being invested. Is it a green bank? looking at regenerative energy in your community, trying to find those opportunities to tap into something that nudges the wider system. And as they put it, this doesn't have to feel like kind of sackcloth and ashes and sacrifice. In fact, less stuff can mean more joy, less consuming, and maybe more creativity, more care, camaraderie, humor, contentment, a sense of culture and community. Some of those domains that I mentioned earlier in the G&H survey may be the surprising benefit of shifting gears in this way. So wellbeing economies, we're looking at different examples from around the world. Wellbeing Economy Alliance, if folks are interested, a global network that is moving in this direction. WeGo, governments that are focusing on wellbeing economies, New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland, Wales, Finland. I mentioned Kate Rayworth. Donut economics is becoming a movement in many cities, trying to apply wellbeing economy more locally. We recently conducted a Leadership for Wellbeing Economies lab, partnering with those in the United States and Canada. And of course, the publications and books, which we hope will begin to connect with social movements, Earth for All, really looking at these innovative policymaking turnarounds, really looking at wellbeing economies as being a central and uniting strategy in the midst of that. So I want to close with a reflection and a quote, which I think brings us back full circle to this idea that well-being is actually not a luxury. It's not something that we hope to have at the end of sustainability, but is actually central to getting there. And this is Andreas Weber, and he says that the goal of leading a fuller life of human flourishing is the most important stepping stone towards changing our relationships with the animate earth and with ourselves. If we adopt this view, we'll begin to see that something is actually sustainable if it enables more life, not just for myself, but for others and for our whole ecosystem. So it's crucial that we rediscover the link between our inner experience and the external natural order. So I'll close there. We've covered quite a bit, and I'm really looking forward to being able to open up the conversation and have more of a discussion.
Thank you, Julia. Fantastic. Thank you very much for informative talk. Is there any question from the audience?
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. You talked about the inner and outer transformation and reestablishing a connection between the two. And you mentioned also the impact of social media, actually. And I wanted to follow up on this question because basically the relation between inner and outer transformation is very much mediated by social media. And that means that we are very often not dealing with an image of ourselves, but with the image that others project on us. And there is actually less and less, I think, the possibility for some to deal with how they are themselves, like acting in the world, but rather they have to deal with an image that is projected on them. And so I think this will not be resolved through meditation, and that will not be solved through systematic change either, but that has to come also with an awareness of how these relations are established and communicated. Appreciate very much your focus on getting away from an economic perspective, but when we deal with a social perspective, I have missed a little bit this time the mediation of this inner and outer transformation through social media, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question and comment. You know, there aren't easy answers here, but I'm glad that we're raising it as part of the conversation. And I don't actually see it as separate from the economy. It's actually a thriving and burgeoning and growing sector of the economy. And it raises questions on policymaking, on setting boundaries, on regulation, which I think for many people, it may be an uncomfortable thought, but it's also really recognizing what are the damaging effects. And it's interesting, when I was doing some research on the impact of media on happiness and well-being, this was as a part of the report to the UN on some of the lessons learned from Bhutan and GNH, how would we bring that to a more international context? A lot of the research was drawn on data that we had from much more kind of primitive forms of media at that time, television, for example, and the exposure to violence, and particularly looking at children and young people. And the evidence was really compelling in terms of health effects, not just in terms of obesity and kind of anxiety over violence, but also more subtle things like social comparison and sense of inadequacy. So now if you expand that out to the kind of social media, the kind of social technologies that we're seeing now, the impacts, again, are starting to show up. So to what extent is that part of the conversation? Are we willing to engage with that? Some of the research on our consumer behavior has shown, for example, that when you look at public media, newspapers, magazines, in many developed countries, they no longer speak about citizens, they speak about consumers. And I think it's here where we need to step forward as citizens and consumers to say, what is the market doing and what is it that we want to influence? And are we happy with the way social media is moving? It's a threat to making the kinds of changes that we're talking about in this series of presentations. We're seeing it's a threat to governance and to actually understanding what is happening in one's country. So I would invite those of you in the audience and those who are working in these social movements and fields to begin asking this question, to be engaging with it as a serious part of the movement towards sustainability to well-being, because it's right now it's seen as kind of untouchable. And right now, I don't think we should see these things as being untouchable.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia, for the first answer. I pick now some from the chat. So one of them is coming through your presentation where you put basically the 9 circles around the GNH index. Do the 9 domains change during the life course, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You wouldn't through the survey be able to track an individual level change over the life course, but you could look at how it's changing at a population level according to different age groups. And I think you would see that these 9 domains are actually shifting as people move through the life course. It's interesting that, for example, as I mentioned earlier in the latest GNH survey, young people for the first time were the most unhappy compared to maybe 8 years ago, when the youngest age group would not have been the least happy. So what's going on? What's happening in their life experience at that point that is leading to that shift? If you look at population data on well-being and happiness plotted over the life course in other countries, it does actually shift. It's interesting that it takes a kind of what you would call a U shape. So happiness and well-being is often higher in the early stages of life, particularly when people are in their early adolescence, moving into youth, moving into young adulthood, a sense of optimism, a sense of possibility and hope. It takes a dip in the middle, which kind of coincides with our popular understanding of the midlife crisis. So there's a point where there's a dissatisfaction, happiness goes down. You see a lot of marriages falling apart at that point, career changes. And then interestingly, in a lot of countries, it starts to dip up again as people get older, provided that there isn't a lot of serious and significant health challenges. And they attribute that, interestingly enough, to what you might call wisdom, a sense of knowing yourself better, which includes knowing your own limitations, maybe some more realistic expectations in your life. But generally, well-being and happiness can go up again at that point. So there is a change in life course. And I think you would see a shift in which of those domains are important at different age groups. So thanks for that question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, fantastic. The next one comes from Wei Gang Yan. and is asking about the factors that make Bhutan and other Nordic countries, let's say, the happiest countries in the world, and how does the conceptualization of well-being economics is different from welfare economics?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So maybe first to address that, I don't think Bhutan would claim to be one of the happiest countries in the world. As I was mentioning in that quote, really trying to say that prioritizing well-being and happiness is really the center of their development strategy and the goal. But there are challenges being met. But I think what you would see in Bhutan are some of the things that I expressed in the slide showing how policies are implemented in the country. And it's interesting, you know, the prioritization on closeness, on access to education and to health, nature, access to nature that is untainted. Those things are part of the foundations for bringing about well-being and happiness, and the kind of resilience, the tight-knit communities that in the face of a pandemic could come together. In the Nordic countries, I think if you look at a lot of the research there, some of the factors I mentioned earlier that are important for well-being beyond GDP are showing up there. So a sense of trust in the government, good governance, much more socioeconomic equity within the countries. A lot of them are notable for gender balance, for policies that allow men to take a more active role in child rearing, and good maternity and paternity leave in those countries. Many of them are also prioritizing and protecting nature. And then I think there are many different factors within those different countries that would each be unique. In terms of the welfare economy and well-being economy, I think quite different. I mean, welfare economy would prioritize the social elements, social support, making sure that government has a keen and active role in ensuring that everybody has access to the basics and to providing for those who aren't able to access basic social services. It's different in the sense that I think a well-being economy is really aiming for that and more. So it's making sure that people don't fall through the cracks, but also saying more than surviving, can we look at an economy that is moving towards human flourishing in balance with nature? I think at the time that a welfare economy was thought of, we weren't so aware of the environmental crises, climate change and so forth, wasn't so much a part of the thinking. Well-being economy firmly embeds human well-being and human welfare within the well-being of our whole planet. So I think there are some connections, but also some differences. And I think the well-being economy, certainly in the way it's being expressed in Bhutan, would also look at that interface between changing the outer social systems, governments and policies, and looking at the mindset, the values, the inner transformation as part of it. A great question.
Thank you very much, Julia. Carry on with the questions linked to what you just said now about the policies of Bhutan. Tobias Henkes asks, when these policies took place in Bhutan, he's asking if there were pressures from the private sector and how Bhutan was able to resist the pressures.
You know, I would say that the private sector is still pretty small in Bhutan compared to other countries. I think the challenge is going to come in the years ahead as it develops to see what is the interaction between business and the GNH values and measurements and vision. There was an initiative by the Center for Bhutan Studies and GNH Research, I think about 5 years ago, they had a conference on GNH and business held in Bhutan, an international conference, and they were trying to adapt the GNH survey to the private sector, to businesses in Bhutan. I'm not sure how far that has developed since then. It was an initial effort. I think probably seeing the kind of tensions that the person who's asking the question was asking about. I think the other pressure is not just within Bhutan, but in a globalized world, the pressures from the market and the private sector that comes from other countries, from trade, from foreign investment. That's definitely going to be a challenge for Bhutan as well. There was at one point, Bhutan was considering joining the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and there was an important decision at that point to step back from that. There would have been obviously economic opportunities, but also a really strong push to develop in a certain direction that would be very much counter to GNH. So I think the global and international pressures from the market are probably as important or more important than the internal ones in Bhutan.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Another question from the chat comes from Budi Khan, and he's asking about the concept of biophilia. How is happiness of nature described in Bhutan and elsewhere?
That's actually a very profound question. You know, if you were in some ways, if you were to speak to indigenous cultures about nature, they often don't have a word for nature that is apart from everything. You know, it's not like there's human beings and then there's nature. There's nature, and within that, we are human beings. And I think that that approach is also, that view is very much a part of Bhutan, Bhutan's worldview, cosmology, in thinking about its place in nature. And so in that respect, well-being of nature is inseparable from well-being of humans. I think many would be aware that Bhutan has different religions, but is predominantly informed by a Buddhist culture. And I think in that perspective, nature is actually considered to be sacred. So similar to many indigenous cultures, not a natural resource to be used and protected, but actually sacred. So some of the policies that I mentioned, I think, come from that viewpoint. There was an opportunity. So Bhutan has these gorgeous unscaled peaks. It's some of the highest unscaled peaks in the Himalayas. There was an opportunity, I think, in the 1980s, I want to say, or 90s, to open up to more mountaineering, because obviously there's a lot of tourist income. You can see what's happened in Nepal with the mountaineering there. It was initially opened up, and then there was pushback from people because the mountains are viewed as sacred, and it shouldn't be a place where people are able to just access and go with their hiking and kind of conquer and put a pole on the top. And so in spite of the possibility of tourism and revenue, they actually put a ban on mountaineering above certain elevations. And as a result, they have some of the highest unscaled peaks in the world. So I think it's a profound question. It's a question I bring back for myself around what is my relationship to nature, and how does that inform the way that I move in the world and the way that I think about the environment and about engaging in it. Does it have intrinsic value of its own worth, or is it something that I'm trying to protect because I need it? It's an interesting and subtle shift. And I think it's a question that opens up when you start to spend more time in nature, interestingly enough. But thanks for the questions. They're very profound.
Thank you, Julia. There is another question from the chat, and this one is asked by Philip from Christ College, who is interested in the impact of the trend of privatization of the public space and the marginalization of vulnerable groups who use the spaces. Okay, so that's the area. And so Philip is interested in the case studies or data regarding combating the negative issues which arise from too much control, surveillance, and too much policing.
That's a very important question when we're speaking about well-being economies. And I think in Earth for All, it's really putting forward the idea that we have to tackle this marginalization of people, which is showing up in inequity in all its forms, as one of the 5 key turnarounds in order to move us from this destructive GDP-based economy towards one that's more life-affirming and more in alignment with well-being. That also means looking at the other issue he raised, which is the privatization of public space, the privatization of the commons, which is connected to the issue I was speaking about earlier, to this idea of entitlement to nature, that it's a natural resource, and that if a company decides that it belongs to them, then they are granted access to it and can make financial returns on it. So really, one of the initiatives that is, one of the policy shifts that is mentioned in Earth for All is really to look at how do we, once again, look at the governance of the commons. How do we look at how we can protect these spaces and make sure that they are actually bringing benefit to all rather than to a few? And how do we protect the environmental spaces that are part of that? So I'd point to the questionnaire to the Earth for All book. I think it really puts forward some suggestions and practical means for moving that forward, and very connected to the conversation we're having. Yeah, thanks, Roberto.
Thank you, Julia. Any other question from the audience? So I'll put forward one question. I mean, my question arises from, let's say, a conversation I had a while ago with a colleague that is a journalist. And we were discussing about one of the many bad news you hear about in that journal, right? It's a very bad news. And I was like, that's not nice to put bad news onward. I mean, why don't we put a positive news, a positive thing? And this guy came back to me saying, good news is no news. All right. So good news is not a news at all. So they basically don't sell journals because of that. So, and now the point is the following. Also, I know I work out quite a bit in this area of happiness and measurements and well-being. And one thing that I struggle with myself quite a lot is the following, that to me, sometimes GDP is the engine of GDP growth is unhappiness. It's not happiness, it's unhappiness, if you think about that. Because if you're unhappy, then you will try to grow. The question back to you, linked to what I said about the journal, isn't rather than a national happiness index to create a change, isn't it better to make a national unhappiness index and try to find a way to classify all the countries of the world with that, and maybe we get impacted with that as well?
Very interesting question, Roberto. To come back to your point about good news and bad news, I think that's an excuse that you hear a lot about why we're not hearing more about what's happening in the world, the positive stories. I try to share some of the seeds of innovation that are happening around the world. I think it's important to share those stories and to connect with those who are doing this work. Because I think that the way this economic paradigm is going to shift will not be one clean break. It will not be a kind of movement from the current system we're in now to something new. It's already happening, but it's happening below the surface of our awareness. And the more these different movements can connect with each other, the more these good stories can actually see each other, the more it becomes possible for them to become more of the status quo. I think we could go into who controls the news media and why those stories are the ones that we see. We could go into neuroscience and show how the human brain, particularly the more primitive reptilian brain reacts to fear and aggression in certain ways, and how, again, cultivating the capacity to be aware of what else is going on in the world and to cultivate those skills to pay attention might shift how we think about the news we want. And then to come back to your question about measuring the unhappiness index, I think we've got quite a few of those right now, actually. You could look at a lot of the indices that are measuring, for example, inequality, the Gini coefficient, and see what's happening there. I think that what's positive about talking about measuring well-being and happiness is it's putting forward a vision of what we want. There are a lot of conversations, research tools, media talking about what we don't want, what's wrong with the system. And that's good up to a point in raising awareness. But as human beings, we also need some hope. And I think we also need some practical steps. So looking at countries that are measuring something different, that are showing a more diverse scorecard, that are showing how we can take steps forward to moving from an economy that is actually growing unhappiness towards one that's promoting well-being. That gives us a sense of forward direction, forward momentum, and some practical policy ideas and next steps for where we want to go. It's just, can we elevate that from being a few quiet voices scattered around the world to becoming much more of the conversation that we're hearing and that we're having? And I think that's part of what the series that you're hosting here, Roberto, is meant to do. Try to bring those conversations forward and spread the word.
Definitely, thank you. So there are another couple of questions, and then I think we just close. The way humanity develops is creating a lot of possibilities. So if you think about innovation, new technology, new media, everything is bombarded in the head of people at the end of the day, creating a lot of noise. How can we reduce the noise and increase the clarity in a world which is very messy to those that are ready to make the change and are open-hearted and so on?
I can speak about that from just reflecting on what it's been like for me to move back and forth between countries that have various levels of noise. And I spoke at the beginning about the reverse culture shock I felt, for example, moving from rural Africa to New York City. I had to change my own lifestyle and practices around that just for survival. In many cases, it meant not checking the news headlines and getting news feeds on my laptop first thing in the morning when I wake up. It's not natural. It's not a way to start your day, and it's kind of imposed on you more and more. I think that these the search engines will find what the stories are that you're clicking and feed more of the same to you. So part of it is a practice and a commitment to actually have some discipline around how you're connecting with a barrage of social media and messaging that's going about in the world. I think another part of it is to cultivate these practices, as I mentioned earlier: open mind, open heart, open will. And as I said, it's not because this is something extra. It's really just to tread water in a world where there's a constant barrage of negative, fear-invoking images and media, just to stay normal and not go into anxiety and neurosis and fear. You need a practice that brings you back to the center, and that's different for different people. For some, it's getting into nature, to going for a walk in the forest, spending time with friends. For others, it's really disconnecting from the media and devices. For me, it's meditation. It's finding some quiet time in the morning before I jump on my Zoom calls. Before I'll go onto a Zoom call like this, rather than preparing by going through my PowerPoints and getting ready to answer all the questions just right, I would actually sit quietly and think, what is my intention for this talk? What is my hope and aspiration for those who are here? How can I keep my sense of compassion open? And how can I envision what it would look like if this were to become more of a social movement? So using my own mind to create a kind of forward-looking vision and intention for what I'm about to engage in. So that becomes a discipline and a practice. And it's a very different one from how do I come onto the Zoom call and make sure I have all my facts straight and impress people and answer all the questions perfectly, which would make me very nervous, by the way. When I prepare in the other way, it kind of opens my heart and makes me feel curious about what's going to happen next. And so that's a way of engaging with any of your meetings, any of the business of the day that's going to come up over the course of your day. It's a practice, and all of us can find our various ways of doing that. And I consider it a form of activism. I refuse to be pushed into negativity and anxiety and fear by the barrage. So what can I do as a kind of individual kind of protest and self-care to keep that balance, to stay centered in the midst of these times? So that's a little personal anecdote.
Thank you, Julia. And very quickly, do you think there is more happiness in high control society or less controlled societies? So that's the way to close the seminar today.
A nice simple question, Roberto.
Okay.
I would say, obviously there isn't, you're saying that half in jest, but I would say that having been in Bhutan, in a country that transitioned recently from a monarchy to a constitutional democracy, where there is benevolent leadership and where people trust the leadership, there's genuine warmth and respect for the king of Bhutan, then that kind of so-called control, or we would say a bit more top-down leadership, can be quite effective. And I would say that control is also, and this is where it comes to the inner dimensions. You know, the fifth king of Bhutan often speaks about self-leadership. He says, these days, we don't need a leader of the masses. Everyone needs to be their own leader. And he talks about cultivating these skills, compassion and care, altruism, self-leadership. And so I think that kind of control, the kind of ability to show up as a leader in your own life, with your own family, your own relationships at work, that multiplied many times is a kind of leadership that we need, regardless of what the political system is. And so maybe I'll leave you with that one, Roberto.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. So thank you for coming. Thank you very much, Julia, for taking the time. As you know, the video will go online as well. Thanks again, all of those that support you. So really, thank you, everybody, also you for coming. Come along next week. So we have Ugo Bardi, so come along. We will be here, same time, 1 week from now. Okay, so thank you all. Bye. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Roberto.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. For more information, please visit clubofrome.org.